All right, so for our final module, it is liberation psychology that we will be talking about, and the concept of liberation within psychology as sort of the ultimate end goal for a lot of the work we've talked about throughout the semester. So APA defines liberation psychology as a movement that emerged in South America with the intention of making psychology a force in the emancipation of peoples from poverty and injustice, rather than a force for maintaining the status quo. The movement was named by analogy with liberation theology that came up in churches in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. So the idea here is that the whole field of psychology, and in particular, a lot of liberation psychology focuses in on therapy, should have a goal of liberating, emancipating people from injustice rather than just being like, check in a box or, well, this is what happens to most of people, so it's fine. Absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. All right, so the articles you'll read here are a lot of theory and background, but I hope you'll find them illuminating and helpful. So you'll be reading liberation psychology, drawing on history to work towards resistance and collective healing in the United States. So the idea, how can we take this concept and apply it here in the US? You'll be reading Liberation Psychology, Origins and Development, which is the first chapter from this book, Liberation Psychology, Theory, Method, Practice, and Social Justice. So again, tying together a lot of the stuff we've been talking about over the course of semester. So you'll learn about sort of the context for liberation psychology and how this came to be within this. This article, I think, is really important. So beyond cultural competence towards social transformation, right? So a lot of what we talked about throughout the semester could be taken with a step back, right? Looking at it scientifically, looking at it theoretically, sort of critically examining things, but then like not doing anything about it, right? And so a lot of what liberation psychology is trying to get us to do is to push forward as a field to actually address some of these things. So basically the idea is they're focusing on cultural humility. So it is an alternative to cultural competence. Cultural competence is essentially, I understand and am trained in certain cultural understandings, and therefore, even as, let's say, myself, a white woman who is cisgender, heterosexual, upper middle class, right, from America, I would say, well, I have cultural competence, so I can treat these people. And the idea is that's not quite enough. We want to be looking at cultural humility. And so the idea is thinking about individual providers, in particular people who are providing therapy, but then they're going to use the lens of liberation psychologies to think about developing a critical consciousness, seeing the other, right? This is sometimes called theory of mind, your ability to like understand someone's perspective is distant from yours, understand someone's lived experience is different from yours, use empathy, put yourselves in their shoes as much as you can, recognizing you don't have the same lived experience. And then also psychosocial accompaniment, working with someone, walking with someone to address these issues. So thinking about oppression, thinking about social justice that we talked about in the last module. And so thinking about cultural humility, again, at this collective level, not an individualistic thing, but on a cultural aspect, on a working together lens. And so they will talk about some examples, including pedagogies, how we teach things. They'll talk about practice-based evidence approaches. How do you essentially take what you learn in your practice if you're going to be an HR professional or a social worker or a therapist and use that And then I mentioned previously in another module, community-based participatory research, the idea that we're not going to just go in and be like, I am smart, this is what you need me to do in your community. But instead we work with members of that community to say, where are things that are lacking, or where are there questions that I can help you start to explore and address using research? And oftentimes members of the community become members of the research team, helping to collect data, helping to analyze the data, helping to present the data. And then the last article you'll read for this last module is Liberation Psychology as the Path Toward Healing Cultural Soul Wounds. I think that we really need to acknowledge, and I think that as a field, we haven't always done this, that any sort of oppression is soul wounding, but in particular, Indigenous communities. So folks that have been displaced from their historical lands, folks that have been treated as other, sometimes almost treated like immigrants. There have been instances of Indigenous peoples they tried to deport them, when in fact, they are the first ones here. We are on stolen land. I want to fully acknowledge, right now I'm in Virginia Beach. That was part of the Powhatan Prime Chiefdom, settled by the Chesapeake people, right? I am sitting on stolen land right now. So internalized oppression becomes something that's really problematic. If you take that in, you apply it to yourself, and that becomes part of the practice, right? Of how, things are given to you. One of the horrific examples I can think of is during COVID, Indigenous communities were often hit very hard by COVID. And they asked for PPE, personal protective equipment, and they were given body bags instead. And as you can hear, that makes me emotional, because talk about injustice, right? Talk about cultural soul wounds. So the author here used liberation psychology that talks about how can we emancipate clients, communities, and in particular, again, they're going to use the counseling profession here, but we can abstract and think about within any profession, within a nonprofit, within HR, within leadership at companies. How can we make efforts to step away from the norm, acknowledge this deep soul wounding? I think that's such an apt description. And use that to move forward in a much more conscious way. You will think about ways to implement liberation philosophy in action in your life for your reflection. And I hope that this is a nice way to sort of wrap things up and think about application even more so for this course.